Here is a turquoise ink by Sailor Studio 140. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Moramon Nemesine notebook. To be fair, this turquoise might be a blue. I didn't bother to look it up. I just simply went by what it looks like. So it could be a light blue. Since I'm looking at it as turquoise, the lighter tone isn't really a big deal to me. The tone, while light, can be seen easily with no huge issue. But as has been seen in some recent videos, I still don't think I would want a whole page of this, just because I believe that to be a little uncomfortable for me. This is very consistent in tone, giving no variation by pen, and even the shading is really consistent by pen, making this a very boring and predictable ink. Boring being a good thing because it is predictable. The pen for today is a Kaweco Sport. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairefontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we see that we can read this with no real problem, despite that lighter tone. Now, we get no feathering, and we get no spread, and the shading just trotted along without any kind of problem, like when you look at trotted on the first line, where you see the T is a bit darker than the RO. Both the T's darken up. During the E into the D, it lightens, but the up and down stroke of that D do get darker again, and we see a lot of color variation like that constantly through this writing. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine. It has no feathering. It has no spread. The thing that you would really want to be asking about now is shading. That a thing on the first line. Look at the amount of shading that's going on here. Where the T of that starts lighter, the H is a little bit darker, the A slightly lightens up, and the T quite a bit darker. Thing starts lighter, gets darker at the H, lightens up during the IN, and during the down and upstroke of the G, darkens up again, shading really well like the extra fine did. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. There is no feathering and there is no spread. There is shading just as well as we were seeing on some of the other writing. Look at said, the very first word, where the S starts a little lighter, starts to darken up some, stays that darker tone, but the end gets really dark at the D. Now, farewell starts as a mid-tone with the F, lightens up on the AR, the EWE gets a little bit darker, and the two ending L's continue getting even darker than that. It's not shading as well here as it did on the others as being stand out shading, but it is shading as well as it's giving just as much back and forth between lighter and darker tones. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We do get shading after all. Look at after on the second line. It starts lighter at the A, pretty light at the A, but it's still easily there. The downstroke of the F starts getting a little bit darker, but it stays a lighter tone until you get to the tur at the end, which is quite a bit darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. There is shading. Take a look at therein on the first line where the T is light. The H darkens up. The at the end does get a little bit lighter, and in starts lighter on the I, but during the end starts to transition to a little bit darker tone. Same with the dot of the I. Morning is a really good example of this happening on the second line, where it really transitions through the whole word from a much lighter tone till during the N into the G, where it gets very dark and lightens up during that downstroke of the G. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We don't have to be waiting for me to talk about shading, because I'm going to do it now with waiting on the first line. Starts as a nice, lighter tone on the W. End of the W gets a little bit darker, holds a slightly darker tone on the A, lightens up on the I, quite a bit darker at the T, lightening up on the ing at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting with no surprises.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairefontaine, though this is the reason that I really was thinking this is more a turquoise, because it becomes really a green leaning turquoise. With no feathering, with no spread, I think the tone of the greenish lean here on this paper really does good things for this ink. I really like the way this looks. As far as shading, when you look it through on the second line, the downstroke of the T is a little, it's a mid-tone. It gets light coming out of the T. Very dark on the H. Lightens up through the R. The OUG a little bit lighter. The H darkens up a little bit. And the right next to it starts light and works its way dark through the word. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, just as dark as on the Clairefontaine, still very much being a green leaning turquoise with no feathering and no spread. Now there is some shading, but I don't think it's as standout here as it has been. You can see it much nicer in the word thousand on the first line, where the T is lighter, the H darkens up, and then it stays pretty light through the rest of the word until the downstroke of the D. You will never spot a ton of shading here. Mostly what you're going to see is like what it says on "you will never" on the first line on the right side, fairly uniform in tone with only a few darker spots. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just as dark as on the Clairefontaine, still being a green leaning turquoise at this point, with no feathering and with no spread, though there is some shading. Take a look at though on the second line, where the T is lighter. The H does get a bit darker, starts getting lighter again. The end of the U does darken just a little bit. The G becomes very light and the H quite a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is exactly the same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. Now here, the vertical lines are not completely gone. see the ink just a little bit more than the vertical lines of this quad rule. So it doesn't really rule it out here, but I don't think this is the best combination for it. Now, when it comes to shading, when we say either go through on the first line, you see a lot of tone shift back and forth between a lighter and darker tones, like on either or on though. And I think it looks pretty good. I just wish it was stronger against these vertical lines. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading, though it should be a little ashamed of itself here, as it's not shading as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. Take a look at ashamed on the second line, where the A is a nice midtone. The S lightens up quite a bit. The H becomes a midtone again into the A, but out of the A, it lightens up through the M, where the ED at the end does get a little bit darker. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. As far as shading, no. We do get some shading. Take a look at no on the first line, where the no is a nice mid-tone. The end of the O does darken up. The exclamation point's a bit darker than that. The second no does the same thing. Lighter on the end into the O, but the end of the O darkening up. Bilbo would be happy on the second line, where the B is a nice mid-tone. It lightens up on the IL, and the B becomes a bit darker again into the O that stays dark. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Sailor Bungabox Fujiyama Blue. Here is Sailor Bungabox Hatsuyumi A Fuji. Here is Sailor Manyo Konagi. Here is Sailor Manyo Neko Yanagi.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is lighter and flatter and paler and not as nice as it was on the Clairefontaine. Really is getting lost with those vertical lines. Now, we get no feathering and we get no spread. We get almost nothing for shading. A couple of spots that do show some midtones with these lights, but it's really rather unpleasant here. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, lighter and flatter and less interesting than it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feathering, with no spread. Now, it does shade better than it did with the extra fine, not as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. If you look at the world on the first line, the T of the is lighter and he darkens up a little bit, where world is mostly really a very even tone throughout, which is what you would expect for a lot of this writing on this paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, flatter, less interesting, just kind of here. The vertical lines still, it's not really standing its own against those lines. Now, we get no feathering and we get no spread. We have the same kind of issue for shading that we had with the medium. There's spots you can find, like on Mirkwood, where the beginning of the M is a little bit darker. It does lighten up until you get to the K into the W, that it starts to darken just a little bit, lightening out of that. But on the second O, it starts to darken again into the D. Looking at the back of the page, there's no bleeding and no ghosting, though no student should be using this on this notebook.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page.
Here is a pink ink by Sailor Kobe number 54.
Here is an orange ink by Sailor Kin Mokusai. Here is a magenta ink by Sailor Granat. Here is a yellow ink by Sailor Kobe number 21. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. We do get some feathering and we do get some spread. You do see both of them kind of happening a bit on the worst on the first line. And speaking of the worst, the shading here wasn't the worst. The worst on the first line, the starts a little bit darker, starts a little lighter. As it gets darker, the feathering and the spreading increase. Not as nice. Worst starts light, gets dark, out of the S into the T. Again, as it gets a little bit darker, it does have a little bit more spread and a little bit more feathering. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, just a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. We get feathering, we get spreads. It's a single spread effect, not spreads, multiple effects, multiple feathers, though. Neither the spread or the feathering is really an issue. If you sit there and look at tell you tales about the feathering and the spread, I don't think it's horrible and unmanageable on this paper, so not so bad. But Tell You Tales does show you just a little bit of what's available for some of the shading here. I don't think it's shading too bad. In the Tell, it starts lighter, gets darker on the first L, lightens up again as it comes out of it. U is a very uniform tone, where Tales, it was only the cross of the second T that did get darker. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. There's still feathering. There's still spread. There is maybe a few spots of shading, like on places on the first line, the end of the S, or directly beneath that on the second line, dark. The K is a little bit darker than the rest of the word tower. Next to that, the cross of the T or the R, a little bit darker. But even still, the exclamation point darker than everything else around it. I don't want to say this shades a bunch, but it does actually show some. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, which, despite any issue that I might have had on the front of the page, this does make it a good ink to use on this paper, especially if you want to be able to write on both sides.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
As stated before about how predictable this ink is, the extra fine, medium, and stub all give the same tone and the same amount of shading generally. So it's nice and easily a dealer's choice because you know what you have exactly and you're going to get it every time. So ink, enjoy, and repeat.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you're not subscribed, I would invite you to do so now.